Hello everyone, how are you all? So this will be the short video lecture for class number 13 of Japan's International Relations. So this is for Takahara Sensei's class. And today we're going to talk about Japan's response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001. So please read the text first and then look at the video, this video one time. Just watch the video from start to finish. Don't stop and start the video. Just watch all the way through. Try to understand as much as you can. And then the second time you watch the video, please have the text with you in your hand, so you can study the text and watch the video at the same time, and then you can start and stop the video. Okay, good. So shall we start? I will show the PowerPoint presentation as I'm talking. So the contents for today's class, well, first of all, we'll talk about the attack itself very briefly. Then we'll look at the US response to the attack, and this will be the war on terror. And then the third part will look at Japan's response. So the support that Japan gave to the US. And then the last two sections will look at the changing security apparatus. So the changes to Japan's military, and perhaps we'll ask the question of whether or not Japan will change its constitution, because that's an important part of this discussion. Okay, and we have three goals for this. So first one is how and why did international relations change after 9/11, and second part is how did Japan respond to 9/11, and how did this cause changes in Japan's foreign policy. So let's start with part one, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So on September 11th, 4 planes were hijacked, and 2 of them crashed into the World Trade Center here, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. And this is the World Trade Center after the Twin Towers had collapsed. And the third was crashed into the Pentagon, so the main office building for the US military. And the fourth one crashed into a field. About 3,000 people were killed by 19 Al-Qaeda hijackers. It was probably the most dramatic event of recent history. So it was carried out by Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda are an Islamist terrorist organization. They had carried out terrorist attacks before this, but they were following jihad, and jihad against the West in general, but especially against America. And of course, this kind of Islamism ideology has some parts that are totally opposite to philosophical liberalism, the foundation of liberal democracy. So there's kind of a, what should we say, an unending clash between these two groups. So, of course, ISIS and later Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, they also follow Islamism. So it's very, very traditional view of Islam, and importantly thinks that religion and politics are the same. So, for example, they think Sharia law should be the basic law of the land. And of course, in the West, we have the totally opposite idea, which is that religion and politics should be separated. So the first response of the US in their war on terror was to attack Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan at this time had been going through a very, very long civil war, but the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are kind of partners, and the Taliban had gained control of most of the country, and they had provided, what should we say, a safe haven, a safe place for Al-Qaeda to use as a base for their terrorist operations. So the US attacked, with its allies, attacked Afghanistan. That was step one in the war on terror. When I say with their allies, the US and NATO. So this is the collective security of NATO. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all members, and so NATO supported America in their attack on Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan. So that was part one of the war on terror. And of course, the second part of the war, the second major part of the war on terror, was the Iraq War of 2003. And this is where, again, mostly US forces, but also other countries assisted, especially UK, assisted America in their attack on Iraq. And of course, it was very successful. They quickly defeated the Iraqi state, but of course there was a very, very long period of insurgency and civil war in Iraq, which is to some extent still continuing today. And importantly too, the Iraq War was extremely unpopular with most populations in democracies. So across Europe, North America, there were very, very large anti-war protests, and some of the largest protests in modern history had been against the Iraq War. So it was very, very unpopular with the populations. So what was Japan's response to this? Well, I'm going to try and put Japan's response into a broader trend. And this broader trend has been this increasing international operations of Japan's self-defense force, going back to the PKO law of 1991, which allowed Japan's self-defense force to participate in UN peacekeeping operations. And Japan did that throughout the 1990s. But also in 1996, there was a new US-Japan Security Consultative Committee established. And the purpose of this was to find ways that Japan and the US could increase their level of military cooperation. And then in 1999, there was a new law that allowed the self-defense force to support the US outside of Japan and outside of the waters of Japan. So all of this was happening before the terrorist attacks of 2001. But of course, the terrorist attacks of 2001 did cause this new anti-terror law. This was passed just 2 months after the terrorist attacks. So there has been this long trend of trying to increase the participation of Japan's military in international cooperation. But of course, it's been extremely difficult to do this. And of course, all of this is slowly breaking down what we call the Yoshida Doctrine, which was named after Prime Minister Yoshida, who decided in the immediate post-World War II period to focus on economic reconstruction and then economic development. And the second part of this was to leave security, national security, to America. I mean, that's very simply put, but it made Japan, of course, dependent on America for its national security. And over the last 30 years more, Japan has been slowly trying to reduce this dependence on America and try and create a more equal partnership with America in terms of security. And of course, the eventual goal of all of this is collective defense. So between America and Japan, more similar to NATO's collective defense. So after the US and its allies attacked Afghanistan, Japan sent its maritime self-defense force ships to support the activities in the Indian Ocean here. So this included support ships and some warships to protect the support ships. So this was the first time that Japan's military went into the Indian Ocean, first time Japan's military left the waters of Japan in the post-war period. So it was an extremely significant, important event. So that was supporting the war in Afghanistan. And then 2 years later, in 2003, after the beginning of the Iraq War, Japan also sent the ground self-defense force to help in the reconstruction of Iraq. Now, the United Nations had passed a resolution on the reconstruction of Iraq. So it was said that the self-defense force could go because it's a UN resolution, but still the government passed the new reconstruction bill, and this was the bill that was used to send the Japanese soldiers to Iraq, and about 600 soldiers went to Samawaha in southern Iraq, and they stayed there for about 2 years doing reconstruction, building hospitals and roads and other civil engineering. And as you can see, these self-defense force soldiers are not wearing the blue helmets of UN PKO missions. So these are the two big events, and the two big events in Japan supporting the war on terror. But let's also look at the changes to Japan's military. So even before the war on terror began in 2001, Japan had been increasing its defense spending and increasing its military power. So throughout the 1990s, Japan was upgrading its military power, and to the point where Japan's military is now one of the strongest militaries in the world. Of course, it's difficult to measure such a thing, but we do have this way to provide a very loose measurement of military power, and as you can see, Japan is number 10, so one of the strongest militaries in the world. And of course we call it the self-defense force, but there has been some new weapons bought, which are, as I said before, it's a little often quite difficult to say what weapons are for defense and what are for offense. But Japan now has these, which are called helicopter destroyers or helicopter carriers. But of course, the purpose in this type of ship is to project power out into the ocean. So it means away from the shore. Of course, it could be defense, but can easily be offense too. And Japan also has a large number of these submarines, which are called attack submarines. But then, of course, also attack is part of the process of defense. And Japan also recently got this F-35 fighter, which is one of the top most advanced fighters. So Japan has been slowly but surely increasing its military power since the end of the Cold War. And also we have some kind of institutional changes, and the biggest one of these is Japan's new Ministry of Defense, which has raised, what should we say, the status of national security or defense within the Japanese government. But of course, I mean, most countries have a Ministry of Defense, so this is nothing unusual. But it's taken Japan this long to create this Ministry of Defense. So the final section I'd like to talk about is constitutional change, because this is very closely connected to this topic. And of course we have Article 9. So Article 9 has these two parts, which are written on this slide here. So Part 1 says, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. So this is the first part of Article 9 of the Peace Constitution. So this is saying Japan will not use force in international relations. So Japan is committed to peace. Japan will not use military force in international relations. And the second part, this part here, in order to accomplish this aim, the aim of the preceding paragraph, this paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerence of the state will not be recognized. So this means that Japan cannot use force overseas. Now this seems to be very clear, yes, will never be maintained. So this means Japan will never have a military. So if we take this one sentence here, then it looks like that the self-defense force is unconstitutional, means shouldn't have. So Japan shouldn't have a military. Seems very simple, but it's not so simple, and this is why I've used this word interpretation. So the one way to interpret this is, in order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, means so as to follow this aim, which is international peace and never using force in international relations, Japan can have military. This, of course, is why we call Japan's military self-defense force. It's only for self-defense. Japan can have a military if it is only for self-defense. So this is a way to interpret this. And of course, there's a little grey area here. it's not exactly clear. So we can interpret this to say Japan should never have a military, or we can interpret this to say Japan can have a military if it is only for defense. This has created a long discussion and debate in Japan, but certainly there are a lot of people in Japan who think we should change the constitution, this part of the constitution, and there are also a lot of people who think we should never change this part of the constitution. Now, generally speaking, it's about 50-50. It varies slightly, and of course it depends on the question, and this kind of survey of the public is problematic. So we're not sure how much we can trust this kind of data. But if we think about the surveys, if we use the surveys that ask the question, then it's about 50-50. About 50% say no change to the constitution, and about 50% say we should change. But of course, we don't know what they say, what change they think we should have. Anyway, there's strong support for Article 9 in Japan. So, we have a changing world in Japan, especially since the Cold War. We have high level of support for the peace constitution. We also have very high level of support for the self-defense force. And we also have high support for an increased international role for the self-defense force. Now, of course, what this role is very important, and for example, UN operations, UN peacekeeping operations, there's high support in Japan for this. But for example, sending the self-defense force to Iraq was very unpopular with a large number of people in Japan. So that is the short video lecture for this week. Next class, we're going to talk about recent developments. So recent developments since 9/11 and their impact on Japan's international relations and Japan's foreign policy. So I will finish this now and see you next time. Goodbye.